The sound of paper tearing was louder than the airport's hum. The boarding lounge froze. A first-class ticket, cleanly ripped in half, dangled from the hand of a blonde flight attendant in Navy uniform. Her voice snapped like glass against steel. "This ticket is fake." Gasps rippled through the rows of passengers. Phones tilted upward. Someone whispered, "Did she just say that out loud?" Another already had the camera rolling. In the center of it all stood Amara Lewis, quiet, composed, dressed in a cream sweater and dark jeans. No jewelry, no entourage, just a carry-on at her feet and calm in her chest. She didn't flinch, even as two security officers stepped forward, blue uniforms crisp, palms hovering near her shoulders. The attendant's tone sharpened, cutting for the crowd as much as for her. "First class isn't for everyone. Step aside." Amara's lips pressed together. She said nothing. Not yet. A man in a red hoodie raised his phone higher, catching the exact angle of humiliation. Behind him, a mother clutched her child's hand tighter, whispering, "Don't look." But the girl looked anyway, eyes wide, watching a woman accused of stealing air she had already paid for. The officer on Amara's right leaned closer, voice low but edged with command. "Ma'am, don't make this harder than it needs to be." The other officer added, louder this time for the recording phones, "You're trespassing in premium seating." Their words landed like a gavel. The sentence was already written. Imposter. But Amara's silence was not weakness. It was weight, anchored, unshakable. She had seen this script before at 22, when a hotel clerk looked at her ID, then at her skin and said, "We don't have your reservation." At 30, when a banker questioned how she could possibly fund her own company. Different uniforms, same performance. And now, again, in the gleaming gate of an airline she had rebuilt from the ground up. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, not of fear, but of inevitability. They were digging their own grave, and she would give them the silence to do it deeper. The attendant snapped again, tossing the torn halves of her ticket into a small bin behind the counter. "Go back to economy where you belong." Laughter broke out from somewhere in the line. Not loud, but sharp enough to slice. Amara inhaled once. Steady. Still no outburst. Still no defense. The restraint itself made the air heavier. Phones multiplied. Dozens of lenses caught the stillness, the insult, the imbalance. And then her first words, quiet, deliberate, shaped like stone. "You just ripped more than paper." The lounge tilted, people leaned in. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Amara. She stood in that circle of suspicion as if the floor itself belonged to her. Because it did, they just didn't know yet. The hum of Gate C-14 carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. The boarding screen glowed Los Angeles, on time, indifferent to the fact that a woman's dignity had just been torn in half with her ticket. Amara Lewis stood in the middle of it, still as marble. She had dressed deliberately without armor, no luxury accessories, no bodyguards, nothing to signal power. To the casual eye, she was just another traveler who had wandered into the wrong cabin. That was the entire design of this moment, because Amara wasn't here only to fly. She was here to listen, to see with her own eyes what passengers had been writing about for months. Anonymous complaints, viral clips, the same thread woven through all of them. Horizon staff deciding who belonged in first class based not on boarding passes, but on appearances. So she arrived without her usual shadow of prestige. No chauffeur dropping her at the private terminal. No platinum tags pinned to her bag. Just her name, printed plainly on a digital boarding pass. Lewis, Amara, seat 2 Ampere, paid, verified. She had wanted the process clean, unfiltered. She wanted to see what happened when the system believed she was ordinary. And the answer had come quickly, in the form of a ripped ticket and a public spectacle. The truth was, Amara knew how this script was usually performed. She'd seen versions of it her entire life. At 16, a hotel clerk in Charlotte had refused to let her sit in a lobby chair while waiting for her parents, insisting, "Guests only." At 29, a banker questioned whether she really understood the loan documents she herself had drafted. At 32, a pilot instructor doubted her competence until she outflew every man in the class. Every time, she had carried the insult in silence, then transmuted it into fuel. The silence never meant surrender. It meant record-keeping. Today was no different. The flight attendant adjusted her navy cap, scanning Amara as though the sweater and jeans themselves were evidence. Security officers stood close, heavy with authority, waiting for her to argue, to resist, to become the stereotype they had already written in their minds. But Amara didn't raise her voice. She simply looked past them, toward the window where the wing of the aircraft glinted under late afternoon light. Her aircraft, her airline. A calendar alert buzzed in her phone pocket, the one she had set days ago as a reminder. Audit Flight 2 Ampere. She didn't need to defend her right to sit in that seat. She had built the very framework that made the seat exist. What no one around her realized, not the attendant, not the officers, not the passengers clutching phones, was that this wasn't random. This was deliberate. She had walked into this gate to give the staff one chance, to treat her like any other paying passenger. And now, every choice they made was being written down not just by witnesses with cameras, but by the very system she controlled. Amara exhaled softly, her calm unbroken. If they thought silence meant weakness, they were about to learn otherwise. The ripped ticket had barely settled in the trash when the voices around her sharpened. "Security, move her out," the flight attendant barked, her tone less about protocol and more about theater. She wanted the passengers to see authority in action. The two officers shifted closer, boots clicking against the polished tile. One officer extended a hand, fingers brushing dangerously near Amara's arm. "Step aside, ma'am. Don't make this worse." Worse? The word echoed through the gate like a slap, as if she had started the storm. Passengers shifted in their seats. A man in a business suit muttered, "What a waste of time." Another, clutching earbuds, shook his head with a smirk. "Some people always try to sneak into places they don't belong." The attendant, emboldened by the murmurs, raised her chin. "First class isn't a lottery ticket. It's for real clients. You've got the wrong boarding group, sweetheart." Her voice carried, aimed not at Amara, but at every phone camera that had risen. Amara's silence was deliberate, but to them it looked like guilt. That was the trap they mistook composure for weakness. Then came the crueler twist. From behind the counter, a junior staffer barely 22, his badge tilted on a crooked lanyard, picked up the other half of her torn ticket and tossed it into the bin with a laugh. "Fake," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for the microphones on a dozen phones to catch. "She doesn't even look first class." That did it. Gasps rippled across the gate. A mother near the corner pulled her child closer, whispering, "Don't repeat that." But the little girl's wide eyes said she already had. One passenger, a young man with a backpack slung low, raised his phone higher, recording openly now. "This isn't right," he whispered to no one in particular, his lens shaking as he captured every second. The crowd had begun to split, some nodding at the staff, others restless with unease. The tension wasn't quiet anymore. It buzzed, heavy and visible, like static before a storm. The second officer leaned closer to Amara. "Last warning. Walk out, or we escort you out." His hand hovered near her elbow, close, threatening. And still, she did not move. Her eyes traveled slowly across the lounge, memorizing faces. The attendant's sneer, the officer's impatience, the passengers' divided stares. This was no longer about a seat. It was about a system rehearsed so many times that the performers thought it was policy. She felt the old memory rise again. Charlotte, age 16, escorted from a hotel lobby with nothing but a paperback in her hands. Guests only. The shame had burned then. But now, decades later, shame had become steel. The officer stepped forward, expecting compliance. The crowd leaned in. The gate felt less like an airport and more like a courtroom. Every phone camera, a silent jury. And Amara, she was still seated, still silent, still waiting. Because she knew, the more they pushed, the harder the fall would be when the truth landed. The officer's hand hovered inches from her elbow. The attendant waited for the spectacle to end with a shove toward economy. Passengers leaned forward, phones lifted higher. Everyone braced for resistance, for shouting, for pleading, for a scene. But Amara Lewis gave them nothing. She didn't jerk away. She didn't argue. She didn't even blink. Instead, she placed her carry-on gently at her feet, folded her hands in her lap, and sat perfectly still. That silence hit harder than any outburst. The officer cleared his throat, unsettled. "Ma'am, last chance." His voice cracked just enough for the crowd to notice. Amara inhaled once, slow and measured, and let it out like a verdict. Her gaze fixed on the digital departure board above the gate, not on the people trying to erase her. The boarding lounge grew quieter, as if her composure was draining the air itself. To the flight attendant, the lack of protest looked like weakness. She smirked, certain the balance of power was still in her hands. "She knows she's caught," she whispered to the junior staffer beside her, forgetting or ignoring that the phones around her were still recording. But to the onlookers, Amara's calm read differently. A young woman in row 3 whispered, "Why isn't she fighting back?" A man across the aisle murmured, "Because she doesn't have to." That was the difference. Silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Amara remembered 20 years earlier, standing outside a glass-walled boardroom as an assistant handed her papers through the door. She hadn't been invited in, not yet. They'd underestimated her then, too. She had waited quietly, let them talk themselves into arrogance, and then walked in with the one document that dissolved their doubts. Power had never been about volume. It was about timing. Now, at Gate C-14, she was doing the same thing, waiting, measuring, watching the trap close on those who thought they were in control. Her eyes drifted to the waste bin where the torn halves of her boarding pass lay like discarded evidence. She could almost hear the paper calling back, proof destroyed, dignity denied. But still she didn't move. The crowd shifted restlessly. A mother hushed her child. A businessman checked his watch. And through it all, Amara's composure anchored the room like a weight no one could explain. When she finally did speak, her voice was low, steady, almost inaudible against the airport hum. "I will not raise my voice for a seat I already own." The words didn't need volume. They carried in the silence. They cut deeper than any shout. And though the staff laughed, though the officers flexed their authority, the balance had already started to tilt. The silence hung heavy, but it didn't last. Someone in the back of the boarding area broke it with a whisper. "This doesn't look right." A red light blinked on. A phone camera, then another, then 5 more. Passengers who had been shifting uncomfortably now held their devices high, lenses locked on Amara, on the officers, on the attendant who still smirked like she was staging a victory. A college kid with a battered backpack spoke louder this time, narrating for his live stream. "We're at Gate C-14, Horizon Airlines, and they just ripped up a woman's first-class ticket in front of everyone." His voice trembled, half outrage, half adrenaline. The flight attendant spun toward him. "Turn that off. Filming isn't allowed here." But the phones didn't lower. They multiplied. A middle-aged woman in a navy coat leaned forward, her voice cutting across the tension. She showed her ticket. "I saw it. It scanned green." Gasps spread. Even the officers faltered, eyes darting between their orders and the witnesses now turning into a jury. The young mother who had tried to shield her daughter finally stood. Her voice shook, but it carried. "My child just watched you call her a fraud. What lesson do you think that teaches?" The junior staffer who had tossed Amara's ticket looked suddenly smaller, his grin fading as phones zoomed in on his face. I didn't mean..." But the recording didn't care about his backpedal. The damage was done. In the corner, an older man with silver hair muttered loud enough for the row beside him to hear, "I've flown this airline for 20 years. Never seen anything this ugly." He shook his head, then turned deliberately toward his phone camera. "And I want my words on record." The lounge shifted. What had started as a humiliation became a stage. Each passenger who spoke tilted the balance further away from the uniformed authority and closer to the quiet woman who still hadn't raised her voice. Amara's eyes lifted briefly, meeting those of the young college kid filming near the pillar. For a second, it looked like she might nod. But instead, she spoke low, almost a whisper carried by the stillness. "Use your words, not just your cameras." The kid hesitated, then swallowed hard. "She's right," he muttered into his stream. "This isn't just about recording, it's about speaking up." And just like that, the energy shifted again. Phones still glowed red. But now, voices joined them. A murmur grew into a wave. "She had a ticket. She belongs here." The staff felt it. The officers felt it. And Amara? She simply stayed still, letting the crowd wake up on its own. The murmur of support unsettled the crew. The balance was slipping, and they knew it. The flight attendant's smirk hardened into something sharper. She lifted her chin, projecting authority the way a stage actor projects a voice. "Enough of this circus. Security, remove her now. She's holding up our VIP boarding." Her words carried across the gate like a verdict, but this time, not everyone accepted it. One officer hesitated, glancing at the growing wall of phones. The other, eager to prove control, stepped closer and gripped Amara's carry-on. "You're done here. Get up." Husps erupted. Camera zoomed. Still, Amara didn't move. Her silence burned hotter than defiance. Then the manager arrived, a tall man in a charcoal suit, badge clipped with authority. His stride was swift, his voice louder than the gate announcements. "What's going on here?" The attendant pointed at Amara, her voice slicing the air. "Fraudulent passenger. Tried to board first class with a fake ticket. We already destroyed it." "Destroyed it?" a passenger repeated, shocked. The recording phones caught every syllable. The manager nodded grimly, siding instantly with his staff. "Then why is she still here? Officers, escort her out of the terminal, now." The crowd stirred, restless, divided. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered their agreement, and then the insult sharpened. The junior staffer muttered again, louder this time. "People like her always try to sneak into seats they can't afford." The words were meant to sting, and they did. They sliced through the lounge, leaving silence in their wake. A young man in a baseball cap shouted back from the row of chairs, "That's not policy, that's prejudice." His voice cracked, but it was enough to spark another wave of murmurs. The manager ignored him. His eyes narrowed on Amara. "You're wasting everyone's time. You don't belong in this section, and if you don't comply, the police will be called." That word police landed like a hammer. The officers straightened, their posture hardening. Passengers gasped again. The weight of escalation pressed down on every seat, every camera, every witness. And yet Amara remained perfectly still. Her calm clashed violently against the chaos, making her seem less like a victim and more like a mirror that showed them exactly who they were. The crowd waited for her to crack. The staff waited for her to plead. The officers waited for her to stand. But Amara simply breathed once, slow and deliberate, anchoring herself to the moment. Because she knew, the higher they climbed on this ladder of arrogance, the farther they were about to fall. The word police still hung in the air when the manager made his move. He reached into the bin, pulled out the torn halves of Amara's ticket, and held them up like evidence. Then, with deliberate contempt, he crumpled the paper and tossed it into the trash once more. "That's where fakes belong," he said loudly, making sure the crowd heard. Phones snapped forward. A chorus of gasps broke out. Even those who had stayed silent before now shifted uncomfortably. One officer stepped closer, jaw tight. "Stand up. You're being detained." He reached toward Amara's arm, fingers brushing the fabric of her sweater. The young mother from earlier cried out, "Don't touch her! She's not resisting!" Her daughter clutched tighter to her hand, eyes wide. The flight attendant smirked and added the final insult. "Economy is at the end of the hall. If you hurry, maybe you'll still find a seat you actually deserve." A cruel laugh echoed from the back of the line, feeding the spectacle. And then came the ugliest moment. The junior staffer leaned over the counter and muttered just loud enough for every microphone to catch, "Figures! Dressed like that? She should be lucky we let her in the airport at all." The room snapped. Passengers gasped. A man shouted, "That's out of line." Another stood from his seat. "Are you hearing this?" But the staff didn't flinch. The manager waved a hand as if brushing off the outrage. "She's trespassing. We're protecting real customers." The words were like oil poured on fire. The officer's hand tightened on Amara's arm, tugging now. She stayed rooted, her body unmoved, anchored to the chair like steel bolted to the floor. The cameras caught everything, the shove, the cruelty, the calm. The boarding lounge no longer felt like an airport. It felt like a trial. The uniforms were the accusers, the passengers, the jury, and Amara, the silent woman at the center, was both defendant and judge. Every insult, every shove, every torn scrap of paper stacked higher. They thought they were closing the case against her, but in truth, they were writing the evidence for their own downfall, and Amara knew it. That was why she didn't resist, why she didn't argue, why she let the weight build until the floor itself seemed ready to crack. Because the moment was near, the breaking point had arrived. The officer's grip pressed harder against her arm. The manager's voice rang louder, calling for removal. The attendant's smirk curled sharper, convinced the humiliation was complete. That was when Amara moved, not with a struggle, not with a shout, but with a quiet precision that cut sharper than resistance. She lifted her phone from her lap, pressed one button, and spoke 4 calm words into the receiver. "Activate protocol flight red." The words weren't for the crowd. They were for someone already waiting. On the other end, a voice answered instantly, steady and professional. Confirmed. Logging incident. Recording live feed now. The officer froze mid-tug, thrown off by her composure. The manager frowned, unsure whether she was bluffing. Amara continued, her tone unshaken. Log every word spoken since boarding. Prioritize discriminatory language. Notify the boardroom channel. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried. Phones around her caught every syllable. The crowd leaned closer. "What are you doing?" the attendant demanded, a tremor sneaking into her confidence. Amara lifted her gaze at last, her eyes locking on the woman's. "I'm documenting your choices." The passengers erupted in whispers. The officer released his grip, suddenly aware that the cameras weren't just phones anymore, they were evidence, corroborated in real time. Amara spoke again into her phone. "Confirm status of flight 237. The reply was crisp, almost surgical. "Confirmed. Systems online. Command protocols ready at your word." A hush swept over the gate. Even those who hadn't believed her until now felt the air shift. Something in her tone, something in the way the assistant's voice cut through too calm, too formal to be fake. The manager scoffed, trying to regain control. "This is nonsense. She's playing pretend. Officers, move her out now." But the words didn't land with the same authority anymore. Not with passengers whispering, not with phones pointed like spotlights, not with Amara seated as if the ground itself belonged to her. She turned slightly, not to argue, but to command. "Document that order. Escalation without verification." The assistant's reply was immediate. Logged, time-stamped, board notified. Gasps scattered across the lounge. The attendant took a step back, color draining from her face. "You're bluffing." Amara's eyes didn't leave hers. "No, I'm patient." The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was weight. The crowd felt it. The staff felt it. Even the officers shifted uneasily, no longer sure whose orders carried more power. In that moment, Amara hadn't revealed her identity outright, but she had done something more dangerous. She had cracked the illusion. She had shown that the calm wasn't weakness, but infrastructure. That beneath her stillness lived a system wired for moments exactly like this. And for the first time since the ticket had been ripped, it wasn't her on trial. It was them. The weight in the lounge thickened. Every phone lens pointed, every breath held. The officer stepped back, uncertain now. The attendant glanced at the manager, but his confidence was slipping too. And then, Amara finally rose to her feet. She didn't rush. She didn't posture. She stood with the calm precision of someone who had already won, her phone still in hand, her gaze sweeping the room. "You wanted proof," she said evenly. "So here at Island." She lifted the phone to her lips. "Confirm my authorization." The assistant's voice came through clear enough for the nearest microphones to catch. "Confirmed. Amara Lewis, CEO and principal owner of Horizon Airlines. Protocol flight. Red is under your command." The words detonated. Gasps erupted from every corner of the gate. Passengers jolted upright. Phones wavered as people whispered, Did they say CEO?" The attendant's face drained of color. The junior staffer who had mocked her stumbled backward, his badge slipping sideways on its lanyard. The officers froze, caught between obedience and revelation. Amara let the silence swell before speaking again. "You ripped my ticket. You called me a fraud. You ordered security to drag me from a gate I own." Her voice didn't rise, but it cut sharper than any shout. "Do you understand what you've done?" No one answered. The only sound was the frantic tapping of passengers uploading videos, captions already flying across screens. "She's the CEO. They tried to kick out the owner. Number Horizon shock." The manager stammered, "Thursday, this can't be." But Amara's stare pinned him where he stood. "It Island. And the only thing more shocking than your ignorance is how confidently you performed it." Phones caught every word, every shift of power. What had begun as her trial had transformed into theirs, and the jury was no longer silent. The revelation detonated like thunder. For a moment, the gate was silent, no announcements, no chatter, just the stunned faces of people realizing they had just humiliated the very woman who signed their paychecks. Then the collapse began. The attendant staggered back, her polished smile shattering into panic. "CEO?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Her hands fumbled at the counter, as if searching for an escape hatch that didn't exist. The The junior staffer who had mocked Amara earlier went pale, his smirk gone. He grabbed his badge and tried to straighten it, as if fixing plastic could erase what every phone had already recorded. I didn't mean, but the cameras caught his stutter, his fear, his guilt. The manager's face flushed crimson, sweat beading at his temples. There must be a misunderstanding, he stammered, his words tripping over themselves. We didn't know. Didn't know? A passenger barked a laugh from the crowd, bitter and sharp. You didn't care. The officers weren't immune either. The one who had gripped Amara's arm released it instantly, stepping back as though her sleeve had turned to fire. His partner adjusted his stance, eyes darting toward the exit, suddenly unsure if following orders had just ended his career. And the passengers once divided were now united. Cheers and gasps filled the air. Phones tilted higher, live streams surged. Some clapped openly, others muttered, "Finally, justice." A teenage girl whispered to her mother, "She's the boss." The mother nodded, eyes wet, and they tried to erase her. The ripple of realization spread fast. In one corner, a business traveler shook his head. "I've flown Horizon for years. Never again if this is how they treat their own CEO." His voice was loud, deliberate, aimed at every recording device nearby. The staff crumbled under the weight of exposure. The attendant's knees wobbled. The manager tugged at his tie, choking on words that wouldn't come. Even the loudest skeptics in the crowd had fallen silent, unable to deny what they had just witnessed. Amara hadn't moved beyond those first calm steps forward. She didn't need to. The power had shifted completely. Her silence earlier had been mistaken for weakness. Now it was undeniable strength. And every face in the lounge bore the same look: fear, shame, and the sinking realization that their arrogance had been live-streamed into history. The silence broke under Amara's voice, low, steady, impossible to ignore. "Lock their access." She spoke into her phone, calm as stone. The assistant on the other end replied instantly, "Confirmed. Crew IDs suspended. Manager credentials revoked. Effective immediately." A sharp beep echoed from the manager's badge. He looked down just as the plastic card in its holder blinked red. His eyes widened. He tapped it against the scanner at the counter, desperate. Nothing. Access denied. The attendant tried hers next. Same red flash. The junior staffer fumbled with his lanyard, hands shaking. Nothing but silence. Gasps erupted from the passengers. Cameras zoomed in. Phones caught every second as the uniforms of authority crumbled into empty cloth. Amara's gaze swept across them, unwavering. "You wanted me out of this gate. Instead, you've been locked out of your own system." The manager stuttered. You can't." "I just did," Amara cut in. "No volume, no theatrics, just finality." The officer who had grabbed her arm earlier stepped back farther, his authority dissolving with the others. He looked at the crowd, at the cameras, then at Amara. His silence was apology, his retreat an admission. Passengers broke into applause. It wasn't polite or scattered. It was thunderous. A wave of claps, cheers, and shouts. "That's justice. Finally! Record this." One woman lifted her phone high and declared, "They tore up her ticket. Now she tore up their careers." The attendant's face crumpled. The junior staffer dropped into his chair, pale as paper. The manager tried to speak again, but his words drowned under the roar of voices celebrating what had just unfolded. Amara didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her silence was victory enough. The applause thundered through Gate C-14, echoing louder than any boarding call. Phones stayed lifted, capturing every angle of the fall, the badges flashing red, the stunned faces of staff, the quiet force of the woman they had tried to erase. Amara stood in the center of it all, still as steel. She didn't raise her arms in triumph, didn't bow to the crowd. She simply waited, letting the chaos burn itself out. When the noise softened, she spoke. Her voice was calm, deliberate, but it carried to every corner of the lounge. "You thought tearing my ticket would erase me, but all you did was rip open the truth about yourselves." The words landed like a gavel, heads lowered. The attendant's eyes brimmed with tears she couldn't hide. The manager stared at his useless badge, chest heaving, as if trying to wake from a nightmare. Amara turned slightly, her gaze shifting from the staff to the passengers. "What you all witnessed here isn't new. It's not rare. It's a script too many of us know by heart. Denial, humiliation, removal." She paused, her eyes steady. "But today, the script ends differently. Murmurs of agreement rippled. A man in the back called out, "You didn't even raise your voice!" Another shouted, "That's real power!" Amara allowed herself a single breath, slow and centered. Power doesn't need to shout, it only needs to stand. The passengers erupted again, not just in applause but in cheers that carried the charge of vindication. The sound was raw, human, unfiltered, a chorus of people who had just seen justice unfold in real time. She bent down, lifted her carry-on, and walked toward the gate scanner. The machine beeped green, valid, undeniable. Before stepping onto the jet bridge, she turned back one last time. Her eyes met the crowd, then lingered on the phones, still recording. Remember this moment, not because I'm a CEO, but because no one should have to prove their worth to be treated with dignity. The words silenced even the loudest claps. They sank deep, heavy with truth, and left the passengers nodding, whispering, some even wiping tears. And then she walked on board, quiet, unhurried, unshaken. The plane wasn't just hers in ownership. At that moment, it was hers in spirit. Behind her, the staff she had stripped of authority stood hollow, the image of power gone. Ahead of her, an entire flight of witnesses carried the story that would spread across the world. No hashtags needed. The truth had already taken flight.